Get started. Welcome everyone, both here and on our virtual YouTube channel. Welcome to the second lecture by our distinguished Goggio Visiting Professor John Foote on calcio, as you see, football or soccer. I never know exactly what to say when I'm using
soccer.
You know, that's fine. It's I think it's one of those great examples of how England and North America, once you just the U.S. are divided by the language or something along those lines. The topic, as I said, is of today's lecture is calcio. Last week it was terrorism, and I thought it was interesting how one of the areas that John works on is in many ways with these two topics we've been looking at sort of two of the probably fundamental events of the moment in Italian history between the late 70s and the late 80s that have shaped in many ways the memory, the living memory of those like me of a certain generation. The 60s this year, I can't remember where I was when Moro was kidnapped. I can't remember where I was on the day of the strage di Bologna, because it was also my birthday. But I can also remember where I was when Italy and qualification for the semifinals and then of course leading on to the finals in 1982. Those are kind of moments that have really shaped Italian identity in at both ends of the spectrum, both the tragic and the joyous. So we started with the Red Brigade, and I'm glad that we are now moving to the other spectrum of recent memory. But you're not here to listen to me. Let me properly introduce Professor Foote. John Foote is Professor of Modern Italian History at the University of Bristol, of the foremost historians of modern Italy, and has published numerous books related to contemporary Italian culture and history, including on Italy's divided memory, on sport, on radical psychiatry and Franco Basaglia, and on fascism, as well as a history of post-1945 Italy. Some of his publications include Pedalare, a history of Italian cycling from 2006, Its Memory, 2011, The Archipelago, Italy since 1946, 2018, and his most recent, Blood and Power, The Rise of Italian Fascism, 2022, and his most recent book, Brigades, the Terrorists who brought Italy to its knees, that came out this year. But in terms of today's talk, his most relevant book is Calcio, a History of Italian Football, that came out in 2007. The title of his talk today, Football and National Identity, the 1982 World Cup. So please join me in welcoming Professor.
Thank you, Luca. Thank you again for the invite to Toronto, and it's nice to see faces that I now recognise here after being here. So this paper came out of the work I did for my book on the history of Italian football, which came out in 2006, and then came out in another edition in 2006, because in 2006 I had this extraordinary experience of writing a book on Italian football, Italy winning the World Cup, and there being an enormous scandal to do with football. And so it was like the perfect mix of things for an historian. This work came out, it was kind of a deep dive into the 1982 World Cup. There is something about that in my book, but this is a much deeper piece of research. It actually appeared as a separate article in later, much later on, after which I did. It was originally given as a paper on a big conference on football history that was held in Long Island, Stanislao Pugliese organised, and that was the occasion where I met Pelé. So it was very, very memorable. I mean, he didn't really know me, but we all we all queued up to meet him. I mean, we took a selfie with him, but I have got a very funny picture of me standing next to him. So what I want to do is kind of dive into the moment, the text of that World Cup, and I want to try and use some of the new ways of seeing the Risorgimento, new ways, and not so new now, the new kind of historiography on the Risorgimento and national identity to kind of get into the text. And also to challenge some of the standard stories about that moment, which, if anyone who works on history or any other subject knows, standard stories about certain things that kind of survive. And actually, when you dig into them, and I really like doing this, you find out a lot of it is wrong or misinterpreted or misremembered. I think that's quite interesting as well. And some of it is very serious, because I think football is a very serious thing. Some of it is also quite fun. So it's a mixture of those things. So the framing of dive into how you connect, why football and national identity connect so much, how exactly they connect. I've taken from this kind of new Risorgimento histories, which are actually not so new anymore, probably about a decade. The book edited by Banti and Paul Ginsburg, Il Risorgimento, published by Einaudi, which is kind of collection of these new ways of looking at Risorgimento history, national identity in general. Alberto Banti's work has been of disciplines. And I think you can bring into this canon of the Risorgimento, which includes paintings and novels and first-hand accounts, and I think you can events very easily into that framing. And the way people kind of connect or discover the nation can often be very powerfully applied through sport. I'm not the first person to say, Eric Hobsbawm said that, it's much easier to identify with 11 people on a football field than with some sort of thing called a nation. But I think that we can think more deeply, perhaps, about the way that connects and why it works so well and why it works so powerfully. Lucy Ryle has written about, and she's very much part of this kind of historiography, about the nation being kind of community established by bonds of affection, nature, kinship, and history. You could kind of think that's what a football fan is. Already you can start thinking football fans have a sense of history, they have a sense of kinship, they have a sense of affection. They also have a lot of hatred, which also into the mix. And Paul Ginsburg wrote about mentality, sentiments, emotions, life stories. And again, you could think of those as applying to sport and sporting moments. The history of the emotions, I think, is particularly here because watching sport, being a fan, is a very emotional activity, and also can run a range of emotions in a very short period. Anyone who's a sports fan knows that you can be laughing, crying, jumping up, in despair, all within, 90 minutes is really a long time, even within 5 minutes of watching a game live or even not live. So those emotions are very much, they're emotions that they're not just emotions that are going on in your head. They make you move, they make you get up, they make you cry, they make you laugh. And I'll show you a film, if we've got time, right at the end, of some sort of genius TV person in 1982 who, instead of the game, watched some fans in a house. And it tells you a lot about how people experience that game, which had lots of highs and lows, the final of the 1982 World Cup. With Banti, he's trying to understand how this emotional connection to the nation works, or worked in the Risorgimento, but I think we can easily apply this to other periods of Italian history and other Italian history. How you transform a basic hypothesis, Italy exists, Great Britain exists, Ireland exists, from a remote and abstract idea into something which seems to have a role and weight in an effective reality. That's what I'm going to argue sport does, and I'm also going to argue how that particularly worked in 1982 for a whole series of historical, sociological, and political reasons. It's a kind of unrepeatable moment of centralization of image and a moment. And I'm trying to kind of unpack that. And Banti also talks about something called deep emotions. And these are kind of where it goes even further, where, a group of Risorgimento patriots get to the stage where they're willing to die for their country, for the idea of Italy, where Italy doesn't need it yet. Okay. Now, we're well aware that that happens a lot with national or political. That happened with the Red Brigades. They were willing to die for being communists, which wasn't anything to do with the nation. In fact, they rejected the whole idea. But my kind of question here is whether football, or how football, can transform this basic hypothesis, the kind of idea of a nation, into reality in a certain moment. It can also do the opposite as well, and we'll talk about that, because it can work in different ways. It doesn't always work in a way that unites. It often works in a way that divides, and sometimes at the same time. So that's something that we can also think about. So when we think about football and the connection with national identity, and of course you could also talk about this with local identities as well, but I'm not going to have time to get club fans and so on, and there's a basic contradiction between that is always playing itself out in tournaments. There's the emotional impact of a football game, a soccer game, I'm not going to use them, where people do all these things, have these emotional reactions to a game, and that 90-minute arc, I think, is very important. That's the classic arc of Hollywood cinema as well, right? The 90 minutes works as a kind of time span very well as a spectacle, right? It's not by chance that films are still kind of, many of them are longer now, but the classic film was 90 minutes, the football game is 90 minutes. And that kind of a lot of chance factors. So it's kind of perfect as a vector for a national identity. And then you have to look at each moment and look how the combination of circumstances, actors, historical context, the media framing, how that all comes together, and of course winning or losing, and how you win or lose matters as well. Who gets the blame when you lose is also really important. Little side story, when in 2002, when Italy lost to South Korea, everyone blamed the referee, and no one blamed the team. And that was great for the team. So it didn't have a particular effect on national identity. It had enough hatred for this ref. There's an account of the players coming back to Rome, and they're terrified they're going to get stoned and chased off the airport, and then everyone's just attacking the referee, so it's fine. They got away with it. So when you lose, it also depends how the framing works. And then you go into the realm of memory. And of course, if you look at the 1982 text, you can see that it's been recreated, repeated again and again in cinema, by politicians. It's a good story. It's a field story, and it's a story that people want to connect themselves to. So people will often say, almost as Luca did at the start, I remember where I was when Pertini got up in the stands. I'll give you some examples of that. It's kind of story that people want to, if they bring it up, people feel good, even if they don't remember it anymore, even if the story's been passed down to them. So let's get to 1982 and see what kind of text it is and what happened in 1982 and why it connected, I think, very powerfully with a unifying moment. In some ways, 1982 is the end of the years of lead. Cup, I would argue, is kind of a moment when the years of lead, and it isn't history books, that's not true. In fact, history books often don't mention 1982 World Cup, which I think is terrible. To not mention it at all, it's such a moment, but that's another side issue about how sport is marginalised. So, spoiler alert, Italy won the World Cup in 1982. It was their third World Cup. And there's this arc of redemption, things that's going on, risorgimento, redemption. There's an arc of redemption I'm going to talk about. Part of that redemption is actually in the tournament itself. They start unbelievably badly and get better and better and better. People have written them off. So there's a sporting redemption, but there's also redemption in terms of the context of 1982, which takes place just after one of the biggest football corruption scandals in history, and something that made front-page news and had led to court cases, including involving some of the people who are playing in these games. Okay, so there's an individual redemption, a sporting redemption, and so on. We're also in the historical context of Italy kind of emerging from a dark period of the political violence, of which had really begun in the late 60s, had gone all the way through to the early 80s, this decade of political violence and economic crisis. And Italy is now going to go on a boom. And I would also argue that the World Cup is part of the reason why that boom takes place. But we'll come back to that later. This is also the first fascist victory of a democratic Italy. Sorry, the first World Cup victory. Freudian slip. First World Cup victory in a democratic Italy, not a fascist victory. And that means that embarrassment, which is always slightly there, whether it's explicitly acknowledged or not a problem anymore. Okay? So he did win the European Championships in 1968, but haven't won the World Cup since 1938, which is obviously under the regime. So it's the third of the first democratic World Cup, and we'll see the way Pertini connects to it, which also reinforces that message. So in terms of the kind of research that's been done already, what you tend to get accounts of 1982 is description or anecdotes, nostalgia and rhetoric. You get very little serious research into the background, the framing, the audience. I mean, very little, almost none, despite it being such an important media sporting event. And a standard story is developed pretty on in the wake of the victory. A standard story involving the games, a standard story involving the politics of it, a standard story involving the so-called spontaneity of Sandro Pertini, Italy's relationship with the games, which I will contest here. I don't think there's anything spontaneous. There may be some spontaneity in his reaction to the game. There's nothing spontaneous about the framing of the way he connects himself to that victory, which is a brilliant political maneuver, by the way. But it's often be seen as kind of the naivete of Sandro Pertini, which I contest. And I think one of the other things that happens with this is that Sandro Pertini is emptied of his politics. And we'll come back to that. He becomes this kind of nice grandfather. Whereas actually he's an intensely political figure who spent decades in prison under so on. That's emptied of his character and becomes a kind of benign, nice guy. Okay, and that's an interesting development there. I don't want to bang on about this, but I think to talk about post-war Italian history without mentioning the 1982 World Cup is pretty odd. To talk about post-war Italian history without mentioning Fausto P. or Gino Bartoli is pretty odd. And I've always fighting against this tendency to exclude sport from an understanding of, I think these events and these people and these characters are some of the most important of post-war Italy. So let's get to 1982 and start talking about some of the ways of understanding that tournament, that victory, and the ways that you could analyse it. And some of this is serious and some of it is playful. Let's start with one of the narratives I've already mentioned, redemption, rebirth, risorgimento, which is both individual and collective. So the most obvious redemption is Paolo Rossi himself, striker who becomes top scorer, symbol of the victory, world famous. People often write his name as one word, Paolo altogether. Even in their stories that his name becomes a household name in China, all over the world, but as written as one word. He had been the symbol of a scandal which is called Totonero or Calcio Scommesse, which is a straightforward betting scandal. Okay, I've got a whole chapter in my book on scandals, a growing chapter about sporting scandals, football scandals, all shapes and sizes. They're all different kinds of things. This was a pretty straightforward scandal in terms of what was attempted to be done. Some businessmen tried to give some money to players to throw games. Now, that may seem simple on the surface. Often this doesn't work. It's quite hard to throw a game because you're being watched by a lot of people. Buying one player is usually not enough. You might want to buy the goal or the ref, but buying a striker isn't really going to cut it for you. It certainly won't give you any certainty. But they did definitely give money. They were kind of low-level businessmen. It kind of tells you how little money there was in the game at that time, even for the top players, that they took it. Some of them took it. Some of them didn't. Some of them said they didn't, and so on. And they were all caught. Some of them were arrested in dressing rooms, so it was pretty crazy stuff. This is a huge scandal, front page news, the relegations. One of the people arrested is Paolo Rossi. Now, he always denied that he had anything to do with this, but the sporting authorities don't believe him, and they give him a 3-year ban. Now, the best players in Italy. By surprise, surprise, this is rescinded to 2 years just before the World Cup. So he can play in the World Cup, but he's not very fit. He hasn't really played, and he's absolutely terrible in the first few games. So there's a redemption. Many people don't want him to be picked. Many people are scandalized by the fact he's picked. They think not only has he been picked after this scandal, but he's also not very good. So there's a kind of, he's the most criticised player in the early games. So the fact that he becomes top scorer, the fact that he basically beats Brazil with a hat-trick on his own, all of this is this massive redemption story. And that's a good story for national identity. Bad people becoming good, that kind of really emotionally connects with lots of people. We also have this kind of story, because they're under siege from the press early on, really under siege. I mean, they won't talk to the press is so hostile, they've stopped giving press conferences, or they put Zoff, the captain of the team, as the person running the press conference. And Zoff was a man who was monosyllabic at best, so would hardly just say yes or no if you were lucky. So there's also this kind of risorgimento image, and maybe I'm pushing things here, this small band of brothers fighting abroad for their country, everyone against them. No one expects them to win, which makes the winning all more emotional when it happens. This is one of the books about about calcio scommessa, which is also something that's been very little studied. Actually, would be a fascinating subject. And this led to a criminal trial. In Italy, there's sporting justice and there's criminal justice. They're not the same thing. Much less evidence needed for sporting decisions to be taken. So Rossi's ban was a sports ban, right? They said there's enough evidence to have suspicions. 3 years is a long time for a footballer. That's quite a lot of your career, especially someone who's so injured as Rossi. But there was also a trial. This was held in the Foro Italico in Rome, where the Red Brigade's Moro trials would be held after that. And all the footballers are trial. It's a spectacular trial. Rossi spent time in Regina Coeli in a cell. Here's Rossi, and here's some other footballers here. They were famous footballers. Bruno Giordano, various others caught up in this network of calcio scommesse. They're all cleared, partly because there's no law that works. So they're accused under a kind of fraud law, which is a general law. There's a sporting fraud law that's brought in later. So it was quite hard to prove. So they're all clear, but they all sit in the dock. They're humiliated. The press cover this and so on. This is the golden boy of Italian football, and he's sitting in the dock talking about how he didn't throw a game and he wasn't offered money, and he's denying it. This is all word of mouth evidence, by the way. Often it isn't, there is money, but this, in Ross' case, he's always denied it, and after becomes top scorer, it's never really spoken about again. It's seen as bad taste, so it kind of wipes clean his record after that. So one story is redemption, and I think that works really well. Then we've got a classic figure from the nation, which is the wise leader, the father. And here there's an obvious candidate, which is Dino Zoff, who is 40. 40 at the tournament, is the captain. He's very reliable, although he'd had a bad comment in 1978, so there's a kind of redemption story with him. But another candidate would be Enzo Bezzot, and they're both from the same part of Italy. They're both from kind of remote northern Friuli place, a certain part of Italy, which has a certain kind of stereotypical connection to character. Enzo Bezzot, the manager, he might be the wise leader, the father as well. And then Pertini, who I'll come back to, who also tries to play that role. So we've got this kind of father figure, father of the nation, that's working quite well as part of the text of 1982. Redemption, father figure. Zoff, you can just show his hands. You don't even have to show his head. And it becomes a stamp. His hands become a stamp of the... Let's also show this is the way this is framed on letters and so on. And many other instances of memory and representation. Also with this text, we've got manipulation and spinning behind the scenes. Now, this might have been Mazzini, maybe, in The Idea of Italy. And here we have a key figure who's never met, which is a man called Antonio Gherelli, who was an extraordinary journalist in Naples, writer, but also wrote the first proper history of football for Einaudi in 1954, a real pioneer of writing, Storia del Calcio, which is a fantastic book. He's a beautiful writer. I still treasure, when my book came out, he wrote me some letters typed on a typewriter, very old school guy. Beautiful letters, beautifully written, perfect congiuntivo and everything, right? He was Pertini's press officer, and he understood about football. He wasn't when the World Cup took place, but he was still in touch with Pertini. And he, you know, I think he's one of the ideologues behind the scenes, advising Pertini how to handle himself with the World Cup, how to look at the World Cup, how to react with the World Cup. And then we have a kind of insider figure. Some people, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you might say, this is one of the reasons Italy won the World Cup, maybe. Artemio Franchi, leading Italian football administrator, is chair of the referees panel. Now, I'm not saying the referees helped Italy, and they didn't particularly in this tournament, but if you kind of see it in a conspiratorial way, there's a protection there against bad referees, which is very important, okay? There's a kind of political protection. Any Italian who follows football is obsessed with referees. I mean, that's the most important in my book on football. It's not the one about scandals or about World Cups. It's the one about the referee. That's how you understand Italian football. It's how the relationship between the fan, the referee, and the squads. I think still today, even with computer analysis of decisions. One of the ideas that's emerging from 82 is the idea that everyone's in it together, which is a very powerful idea of national identity. So we've got North and South linking up. You know, we don't have a Southern question in this football team. We've got Causio from the deep South. We've got Zoff from the deep North, and they're all working together. They're all part of a team. Okay, so that's good. That's a good story to tell, right? This is a rain squad in some ways. We've even got someone who's born in Libya, Claudio Gentile, nickname Gaddafi, right? Who is famous not for for eliminating the opponent from football, famously marked Maradona out of the game by not letting him touch the ball, by fouling him about 100 times. The ultimate Italian defender, and that is celebrated in the accounts. And we have, you know, the people who do the water carrying, and the people who are the fantasisti, the creative people, and the people who do the hard work. So that's how a nation, the working class, if anyone's read Cuore, you know, it's all about class unity. That account of the school, it's the work, you know, the poor boys and the rich boys, they're all working together, everyone's on the same page. This is kind of Cuore in football terms, right? And then you have the romantic artists. You need romantic artists for a nation. You need the people who can think outside the box. And we have lots of candidates here. Most obviously, Antonioni was a creative player, but he gets injured, so he's got a tragedy attached to him. He doesn't play in the final. Gaetano Scirea, the very elegant defender who never fell over, never got his shorts dirty. He's also a tragic hero because, in retrospect, he dies very young. He dies in a car crash when he's after the tournament. And you could also, maybe I'm pushing things here, analyse the goals as works of art. Maybe I'm exaggerating. I would say first goal of Italy against Brazil is a work of art and should be in an art gallery. Just the kind of tangential movements of it are so beautiful and perfect, but maybe I'm going too far. So one of the things also about this, in world terms, is that Italy don't play catenaccio, don't play defensive football. They're kind of let off the leash. There's an overturn of Italy in terms of football that takes place. And these ideas of redemption, individual and collective, are intersecting in this tournament. The emotions are being ramped by the fact that Italy is so terrible, by this underdog. No one expects them to win. They're playing the best team in the tournament, Brazil. The games themselves, the way they ebb and flow. And all of this within the games, across the tournament, across quite a long period of time, weeks when this is being built up as Italy were terrible and then get better and better and win all their games, increasingly looking like they're going to win. And this kind of emotional outburst allowed its kind of most ultimate expression with the second goal in the final by Marcoli. Not so much the goal, but the scream, l'urlo di Tardelli, which is released, and he said in interviews, it's lucky they stopped me, otherwise I'd still be running. And I think we should have a look at that goal, if I can find it. Yeah, let's have a look. It's like a comedy now. Not very good. Okay, that wasn't really what I expected. Sorry about that. I'll blame Toronto internet. You don't really get an idea of that. One of the things about that goal, which is extraordinary, is that Italy has 4 defenders in the opposite area, and they're backheeling the ball to each other, overturning a kind of stereotype as well. So that's the moment of release. It's a moment everyone remembers. When Italy win the World Cup in 2006, there's a goal by a player called Grosso. He goes on a run screaming. He's not allowed his own scream. His scream is immediately compared to Tardelli's scream. Tardelli's scream is the scream. There is no other scream that can be allowed. This is the one that remains in the national consciousness. To understand the power of this, and that's why I say it's an unrepeatable moment. So that's the kind of framing around emotions and national identity. But we have to look at the kind of facts and the structures in place. Well, we have to kind of get down into nitty-gritty to understand why this is such an important moment, why it's so centralizing, why there's so many people see it and experience it. And here we have to look at the media, okay? So this remains, forever probably, the most watched program in Italian TV history. And I don't think that record will ever be broken, because now you've got a very different landscape of media. In 2006, you had a choice of channel on. You have the internet. People are watching it on VPNs. You know, that's only going to increase. 1982, everybody watches the same transmission on a physical TV in their house, or sometimes in piazzas, but often in their own house with friends or family. 95% share. And I always think, and I haven't done this research, what was on the other channel? I think that was a real bum deal. The person's program was put on the other channel. But also, who chose to watch the other channel, which is another fantastic question that we can ask ourselves. So 32 million people, at least, an underestimate, 32 million people in Italy watching one thing. That, I mean, just on its own, that is an extraordinary moment. There are moments like that, coronation, for example, the British coronation, the BBC. There's a huge population, but there are very few moments like this. And this is not political. This is left-wing and right-wing people. This is different classes, north and south, all watching the TV. So that moment is extremely powerful in itself, all with the same commentary, the same framing, the same images. That won't be repeated. They haven't got phones in their hands. They're watching a TV screen. Okay, so it's a very centralizing moment where people have the same memories connected to the match. So I'd say it was a shared experience of immense power. And some sociologists and historians have talked about a footballization. It's not footballization of Italian society taking place in the 80s and 90s. Football dominating, with Berlusconi even more so, right? but dominating political discourse, dominating everyday conversation. You could argue that this is when that begins. 1982 World Cup, footballisation of Italian society. We could talk about that later. This framing, if we dig down a bit further, the power of the actor in the studio, what images to choose is going to frame how people experience the match. So that counts with Pertini a lot. The commentator is a man called Nando Martellini, very experienced commentator. So everybody will see the game through his commentary and will remember some of the things he said. Most famously, when the final whistle goes, the referee picks up the ball, which is quite a weird thing to do, and Nando Martellini, campione del mondo, campione del mondo, campione del mondo. Now, this is a very effective rhetorical device. It's a repetition, but it's also, we've won 3 times, right? Our 3rd World Cup. Slightly embarrassing because 2 of them were, but nonetheless, campione del mondo, let's not dish that. So he's obviously prepared this, right? He's not made that up at the moment. He's got this ready, he's written a script. So he's framing, he's obviously got a script if Italy lose, that's not, but, so that is one of the ways that people remember the end. They remember Itali's goal, they remember the end. Newspaper headlines, it's the moments when people go and buy the Gazzetta dello Sport to keep, as a to put on their wall. So they buy it as a souvenir, which is not always doesn't happen maybe when people landed on the moon or, when the Republic is declared. So Gazzetta dello Sport goes with Campione del Mondo, Corriere dello Sport, Goici, a bit fascist, but we can forgive them. So those, and people keep those in their attics, and they've got record sales. But most people don't read the paper; they just want the headline. Let's go to Pertini. Now we have this very odd picture. Okay, this picture gets issued during the semi-final. I don't think there's anything on that TV. This is a brilliant piece of spinning, political spinning. Pertini, Italy's grandfather, is watching the game. He's very excited about Italy's victory. He's not actually watching the game, but it's a great photo, right? So thinking about how we can connect Pertini to this game. How can we connect Pertini to this? This is not a spontaneous series of events. This is being issued to the press, okay? It's being published in the press. So there's a framing, there's a exploitation of this moment, which is very conscious, but is meant to appear spontaneous, okay? Just a memory, just to remind you of who Pertini was. In the First World War, he was an anti-fascist. He'd been at Caporetto. He's like appears at every moment in Italian history. He knew Gramsci. He takes part in the first act of the resistance in 19 He's like everywhere. So this is a very important person, historically speaking, someone who's kind of got a memory. He's like the historical memory of Italy. His brother was killed in a Nazi concentration camp. He's part of the Discute Mussolini. And in 1960 in Genoa, when there are anti-fascist riots, he's there as well, making a very incendiary speech, which I'll have a look at in a minute. In 1978, he's elected president, dark moment, and I Piombo. He's called the president of funerals. He's always at funerals, okay? But he seems to bring people together. So this is someone who's kind of like deeply connected with Italian history. And there's a kind of myth that gets created around him that he's not political. He's a man of the people. He doesn't live in the Quirinale. He lives in a little flat in the middle of Rome. He drives his own Cinquecento, okay? The president of everybody. Now, this is a myth that's partly spontaneous, but often created by his press office, by himself. And then there's the physical appearance, the grandfather, nonno, always with the, etc., etc., etc. So let's go to how he connects to this game. He only goes to the final, right? This is very clever. So he's not, even if Italy lose the final, they've done pretty well, right? If you go into the quarter-final, they lose, he can be something, portato sfiga, no? He's brought bad luck to. So he's very clever in the way he only goes to the final. By that time, it's going to be a success story almost, more or less, right? They're playing Germany, but they've done pretty well given that no one expected them to get anywhere. He speaks in the universal language of a football fan. something that Berlusconi will do later. He speaks to the team. He talks about tactics like anybody would in a bar. And is very much in contrast in the way he's framed with other dignitaries, including the royal family. This is in Spain, this World Cup, by the way. Other politicians want to get in on the act. Spadolini wants to go. He makes sure he's the only person who goes. Okay, so no one else is allowed to go to the game. Spadolini tries to connect himself to it, but no one remembers Spadolini's connection with the World Cup. And then what's a touch of genius, which is on the way home afterwards. But in doing this connection with 1982, which becomes almost the most important thing about him in public memory, he's emptied of all that anti-fascist past. He becomes this kind of unoffensive figure, a normal grandfather. And all that kind of militant past is often forgotten in the way that he is remembered today. Let's look at Matteo Renzi. First speech to Parliament, 2014. You may have forgotten that Matteo Renzi was Prime Minister, but just reminding you of this. He wants people to feel good. He wants to make a feel-good connection, classic spin doctory thing. He's remembering, if he's actually remembering or not, this redemption of the World Cup. The terrible years are ending. I remember Pertini. So he's remembering less the game, Pertini's connection to the game, right? And then what we're forgetting is this kind of Pertini. So this is Pertini in 1960 in Genoa, in the middle of a very tense situation, talking about, yet to the near-fascists who are still out there, I was proud to order the execution of Mussolini, because I, along with others, merely carried out that death sentence pronounced by the Italian people. Pretty hardcore stuff, right? In the middle of quite a tense moment in Genoa, and there are riots going on and so on. This is political Pertini. He's not become that. He's become emptied his own past. He's become a grandfather with a pipe. And it's because of 1982 that that's happened. And very important, he's in the stands. Very important to the framing, the way he's connected, is the way the TV keeps going back to him. So we go from the goals to Pertini, the goals to Pertini, the action on the pitch to Pertini. So it's decided that's the shot. Quite rightly, it's a brilliant piece of directing. Third goal, out of belly, 3-1, it's all over, in the crowd. Let's go straight to Pertini. They're almost like they're the same, you can play around with it, but it's like it's a 12 player. He's on the pitch, he's part of the team. And it's a fantastically powerful combination. Nobody who remembers 82 remembers Pertini, doesn't connect Pertini to that moment. So much so, he even gets depicted as a player in some depictions with an Italian shirt, playing in the team, the 12th, 13th man. I'm not going to show you that because the quality was so terrible, so you can watch that in your leisure. The final, and then we have the framing of the victory, which again connects Pertini very intimately to this. For me, this is touch genius, is on the plane back, and in the old days, you had a table on the plane, right? And they're smoking away and whatever. This is the plane back, there's the World Cup. They're playing cards. So he is again connecting to the players. He's man of the people. What do people do in bars all over Italy? They play cards. They have an argument about one of the tricks. I think it's Scopa they're playing, something like that, Scopone. Bezzot, Pertini, Zoff, all the wise fathers in one place, all at one table. And it's very funny to watch the film, which again I would show you, but I don't want to show that Keystone Cops kind of now. The framing continues on the arrival in Italy. And again, this is my contestation. I think probably you've got the point now. This is not a spontaneous series of events. This is very carefully organized. He is first off the plane at Ciampino, holding the cup, which is quite odd, but people like it. The cup is passed, not holding it, but he's the first person off, the cup backwards. There are huge crowds at the airport, and they're saying, should we take a helicopter to Rome, the center of Rome? He says, no, we're going to go in a car. So even though there's massive traffic, they want to be part of this long party that's starting. And then we get to the reception in Rome, Bezzot, Zoff, Cup, Pertini. And here I'm playing around, but I quite like doing this. And here I'm being evocative, 82, the whole team, Brunante, various others. There's another World Cup, very similar picture, although they're in military. So that's a bit provocative, but I'll leave that there for you. Finally, the final part of the story is the party, and I'm going to get to Toronto in a minute. So after Big Vic, fans like to go in the streets, they honk their horns, this is summer, remember? And this is a spontaneous party. It has flags, people jump in fountains, people, sorry about this, say death to the Germans. So, we're not that far away from the war, but we are quite a long way away from the war. And then we have this huge explosion of parties in immigrant communities, which happens across the world, which I'll come back to in a minute. So there's a kind of ritual, but there's a spontaneity to it in this. And we get some great accounts of these parties right across Italy. A kind of reclaiming of the flag. The flag had been quite toxic in the years of lead. You wouldn't see any left-wing people with the tricolore. But we have these accounts, this is from La Stampa. Many had taken the royal symbol on them, having been taken out of the cupboard after 40 years. So they've got the flag somewhere, they don't know where it is, they've got it out, and they're cutting out the royal symbol sometimes, and it's got a hole in the middle. This was a night when everyone, si danno. Okay, so this is kind of community being created, right? Some of this is rhetoric, but nonetheless, they're all fans, and also those who knew nothing about football. It's bringing people together. There's a huge collective party. People remember it. Goes on for days, and it's global. It's not just all over Italy. It's New York. It's Toronto. It's Buenos Aires. It's all over the place. And I found an article. I even did some original research for this. July 11th, 1982, day we became Canadian. Which is about the Italian Canadian experience of that. Everyone's on the streets. And it's quite strange, isn't it? The day we became Canadian by being really Italian. I mean, we could talk about that later. This is kind of the celebration. It sets the bar for all the others. And the only thing that comes close, I think, is after Maradona, which is like probably the closest to a kind of... 2006 is not as powerful, and I'll come back to that in a second. So cars, which is a kind of modernity part of this, fake funerals of Germans, fountains, noise, starts during the day and goes on for weeks afterwards. And you can see pictures of this, people in their cars, honking their horns, flags, every city in Italy. And I did have this is Toronto. I don't know where that is, but you probably do. College Street. So this is, the reason I included this, and I've not been talking in Toronto, is just that such a striking number of people out on the streets in a different country to there. So the legacy, and I think this is an important event in Italian history, and it's because it brings people together, the sense of national identity, closes the years of lead, but there's an economic effect, there's a social effect, there's a political effect. Maybe that you could exaggerate it, and it's quite hard to draw Gillette lines, but this is a boom. I'm not saying that's coming from 82, but it's helping the image of Italy, the positive image of Italy. There's certainly a boom in football. All the best players in the world come to Italy in the 80s, becomes the richest league in the world in the 80s. That is also connected, and then runs up to the 1990 World Cup. Berlusconi gets into football in the 80s. There's the idea of glamour, the footballisation of society, whatever that means, you could argue is happening in the 80s. And other people have also argued this. Journalist Oliviero Bea talked about the global image of Italy being transformed. And this is where Paolo Rossi being this global figure after 82. And then you get to the realm of memory. And I haven't got time to talk about that there, but you can find many examples, 82 being recreated in cinema, it's in the mio gioventù. There's a whole, there are whole films set around 82. It's in fiction, it's in public memory, it's in political speeches. And as the play has been dying, there's a kind of recreation of this moment again and again. Berzot funeral, and you've got the kind of, still got Zoff there, so still involved in that kind of commemoration of that period. So I would argue this was a very important moment of identity. I've tried to argue why that was the case. What was the power of football? What was the power of this particular event? The way that Pertini was identified with it, and also the public memory, which will be another paper. I wanted to show you, but I don't. But I can send you the link. This is a fantastic. It's a nice way to finish, but it's not really working very well. But someone in Genoa decided to set up their camera watching a load of people in a house watching the game. And what you get in that image is, what you get in that film is this, you see the people jumping up. There's a missed penalty, if people remember the game, by Italy. And so there's a brilliant moment when everyone's jumping out, they've got the penalty, then there's a moment when they miss the penalty, which is of less excitement. So what it does, that film, it shows you the way the emotions are running through those crowds of young old people. There's a grandmother in the kitchen, there's all kinds of people, and the way that people experience that game in their own domestic space often, which it makes it more powerful, I think. Okay, I'll finish there, thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you. As I said, I have personal memories of this, so it's hard to approach these things with a sort of scientific perspective, but it was really fascinating. Questions? Yes.
Thanks a lot, John. I really enjoyed that. I have a question about coming with sideways. I'm thinking of a very, very bad American movie, Forrest Gump.
Mm.
And so in that movie, you have scenes in which white people and black people get along nicely. And I think the emotion that it elicits is pretty powerful, but it's also detaching the reality of American society.
Mm.
And it's perhaps the detachment from American society that's so powerful emotion.
Mm.
So let's go to football now. Think of the French victory in the World Cup under Zidane.
Mm.
So the team was the Bleu, Blanc, Bleu. Right? So this is a racially dividing power, the emotional potency of the victories that shows that a multiracial, multicultural society can work, and this is an illustration of that.
Mm.
Now, the powerful emotions in either case, but also detachment from actual social reality. America is very racially divided.
Mm.
France has real problems when it comes to immigration. So now we come to your case. When I think of Italy, I think of Campanilismo as being the primary identity. It could be that it's transcended during this kind of moment, but I'm actually a bit skeptical when you talk about the long-term effects when it comes to identity. So the very power of the emotions you about can actually reside in their opposition to a lived reality.
Mm.
So let me connect this to a final question. I mean, it seems to me that you use the word redemption a lot. And is it trope, or is it emotion, or is it connected to an emotion?
Mm.
And I guess I'm asking that because, let's say it was Campanilismo that was transcended at this moment.
Mm.
What was the corresponding emotion if it wasn't redemption?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think whether there's two things, there's a lot on what you've said, but the long-term effects, I'm not so sure about. I talked mainly about footballization and economic effects and image effects, but I'm not sure about the long-term effect. It doesn't have necessarily, I don't say it has a long-term unifying effect. I think as a memory, when people think of that moment, they think of it as a moment when they felt Italian. Doesn't mean that 3 months after to being hating Southerners or, you know, being more interested in being from Pisa than from Italy. So I think I would be very careful to not say there's a long-term on national identity or unification. I think there are other long-term effects which are more economic. So I think it's very correct what you're saying about being skeptic about that. Is it tea? No, but it feels like it is. I think people feel Italian in that moment. That doesn't mean that the reality of a fractured problematic has been overcome, but in that moment people feel as if it has. I think that's the emotion it creates. And in the memory it does. But if you go very quickly to others, you'll find people tearing themselves apart over other sporting events, blaming everybody else. Okay, so that's a big question about the long-term effects, and I don't know how you could measure that. I don't know how. It's such a difficult thing to measure anyway. I mean, you could do statistics and so on, but they don't get it, in my opinion. You know, do you feel English? Do you feel British? Does that get what I'm talking about, which is deep emotions? I'm not sure.
I was wondering if it's not the very nature of sports like football that have such a strong presence at the local and the national that has that kind of allow you to play out that tension, right? So in the Campionato, that's all about that local campanilistic identity at the most sort of visceral level, even again between, you know, Pisa and Firenze,
Pisa and Livorno.
once we're relegated. But whereas at the national level, that local identity is transcended, and you identify with. And it seems that, you know, sports that have that sort of dual track, if you will, where you have the local, very highly felt emotion of you know, your team, your city, your place, but then there is a international tournament where you suddenly discover that those, you know, the team itself brings together the best players from all these local identities, and so there's kind of this supranational identity.
It's very quickly people can turn, and this kind of comes back to your question. I've just been thinking, like Paolo Rossi 2 years later is getting booed by everybody, so people can turn as well, and the campanilistic, I would say, like, or localistic attitudes can very quickly come out. So even people talking about 82 sometimes will say, yeah, they only won because they're all Juve players, right? Now that's a localistic or local fan-based way of understanding. But then it will turn the other way. So there's ups and down waves of this thing, and the way it's interpreted also matters in terms of the present.
Thanks so much, John. That was really great, and I really appreciated your opening line about sport deserving and needing the dignity, right, of this. And I think it's similar also to like things like food studies, right? And I think I have that in common. I just wanted to, you know, also support you with your idea of goal as a work of art, right? But you know, honestly, the image or the choreography, right? This embodied, you know, element, I think is very important, and I think there's definitely, if you wanted to do a museum show, I think you could definitely have you could put something together, and I think it's very popular. And then just a side note on footballization, I think it might happen a little bit. My knowledge is more on Spain and Catalonia, but one thing I do notice is that how sort of popular or like the sort of heroes, right, the intellectuals, the authors, right, who are those ones who are sort of capture the popular imagination among a certain, you know, bourgeois class, get replaced in Spain, maybe a little later, by football players and chefs, right? And they become the new like Messi, Afak, you know, Adrià, become the new people in that sense. And then, you know, it was funny just also thinking of local like Barca and Real Madrid, right? And how when Spain finally wins, it's because there's been this union, right, of Pep's team, of Guardiola, under the yoke of this central.
But then when you lose, it all reappears, right? The next second it's because those people are Catalan and they're not really Spanish. So it's the kind of, it's the moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
1970 World Cup. So this is a really interesting counterexample in some ways. Italy do really well. They get to the final. They beat Germany 4-3 in one of the great games. Gets to the final, gets smashed by one of the greatest teams of all time. Come back and everyone's furious with them. Like they can't get out of the airport. And it's that something has happened in the framing of that game and of that final that has made people absolutely furious back home and not see a kind of, can't take an objective. Their emotions have been turned in a certain way. So there's something that, you know, I think the framing is so important, and the framing, even a defeat doesn't necessarily have to be a backlash, but it's the way it's framed. What becomes the important part of the story? What becomes the crucial part? Is it the ref? Is it the fact that they weren't seen as not trying? Is it the manager? What's the crucial way of telling the story?
Well, and one last thing, my poor mom I grew up in Calvin Village. I didn't watch soccer until I went to Spain when I was 18. My poor mom and grandmother were on a tour of Italy when they won. They were there. All my mom came back,
Okay.
like they thought they were going to turn the tour bus over.
Bad timing. I've got a quick story on that. I was in Milan when Milan won the European Cup, and I remember getting a bus and the roof of the bus. So that was the end of that bus journey. So yeah.
Yeah, so I guess this is going off maybe from this question as well. And so the focus on transcendence, and this quick phrase that you've repeated about these are group stories, and how the national identity and national community are based generally on group stories.
Mm.
What about the case in which like national identity is based actually on moments of refusal, wiping out diversity, moments of rejection, and that often happens in soccer as well.
Mhm.
And maybe this does not apply to the 1982 World Cup, but I
Mhm.
can think of how the figure of Balotelli was used in the media when he was winning or when he lost.
Mhm.
When he was winning, he was like the national hero, widened, and at the same time when he was losing, that it was he losing only singularly, let's say, only on Balotelli, not the national team. So I feel that unfortunately often national identity and sense of communities are based on rejections, not on transcendence.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. This is one story,
Okay.
but there are many other stories, and often they're based on another. It could be a southerner. It could be Balotelli. It could be there are many other ways that national identity works. It doesn't only work in this way. This is a way that's worked generally in positive. The anti part of this story doesn't really exist particularly. It's wiped out by the story. I mean, I've written on Balotelli and how he became a scapegoat. You know, that he was the scapegoat for a number of defeats, particularly in one World Cup and in other tournaments. I mean, there's that old story about the joke about Andy Murray, the Scottish tennis player, is that when he won, he was British, and when he lost, he was Scottish, right? So, you know, it depends on the framing. But I totally agree with you. Of course, national identity can work in all kinds of ways, and I wouldn't apply this universally to creation. I think it's the way of reading this story, but there are many other stories that can work in different ways and more violent and problematic ways, of course. And when I say it's the end of the years of lead, it doesn't mean it's resolved. Of course, it hasn't resolved anything. But in people's minds, there's a powerful idea that it's finished. We can get on with our lives or whatever, something like that, which can be very powerful, but it doesn't mean anything has actually been worked out.
I was going to take debate on your juxtaposition of Mussolini. And I think what's interesting about it is as I think of a book I read a few years by Luciano Keres on representations of Italian presidents.
Yeah.
And that after the war, there is this really deliberate effort to not create cults of personality around the president of the republic. And so, is this not only with Pertini, but with sort of in general figure of the president as sort of such a present figure as an individual, not just an office holder. Is this the moment where that comes to the fore, or sort of what's the differences in sort of Mussolini's team relationship to the team versus Bettini's relationship to the team?
Sure. I think that's a really interesting point about whether, I mean, the classic analysis is the president of the Republic stronger as the century goes on, as the political party system starts to collapse, and maybe Pertini is the beginning of that centrality. So if you remember, the presidents after become more and more Scalfaro, Napolitano, etc., Ciampi. Yeah, and so he may well be beginning of that. There is certainly a cult of personality around him. And I think you're probably right that the presidents before, who are we talking about, Gronchi, yeah, there's no cult of personality around him. Yes, I think you're right, and that's interesting that that's a specific thing. I think, you know, my photo is a provocation because to compare Pertini is almost sacrilege, right? They're on, you know, Pertini ordered the execution of Mussolini. He was the ultimate anti-fascist. But what I was trying, I suppose, to do with that provocation was to say that all politicians, or when a politician understands they can use football, there are only a certain number of ways they can do it. And so they've used exactly the same framing there. Probably not consciously. I don't think Pertini knew about that photo or anyone had organised it. It just becomes the way you can identify yourself with victory. But Asconi was always furious that Italy never won the World Cup. If you remember the 2006, he just lost the election by 26,000 votes. That's an election, which he blamed on, electoral irregularities. But Prodi got to be the prime minister. Prodi didn't understand football at all and completely missed his opportunity to identify with the 2006. The 2006 and 82 are really interesting. Prodi was a cyclist. He liked cycling. He didn't understand, and all he had to do was go to the game. That's all he had to do. Stand up. He wasn't advised properly, or, you know, he missed the opportunity to do it.
Somewhat on this side, I thought, but yeah, go ahead.
I have two things. Oh, wait.
No,
For you, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so my question is, what is actually football? Like, where does it start, where it end? I mean, is football just a game? Is it the players? Would be one question. And then the other question would be, if football is an event that is used, you also think about Eurovision Song Contest, right? So the question would be, how are these events used, and what is their bigger role on an international scale? So what is soccer in Italy, but in Germany you could tell the same stories about the 2006 World Cup.
Yeah.
Now I think Time Magazine had it on its title page, German patriotism is back.
Yeah.
After so and so many years, Germans waved the flag. Turkish Germans and other Germans kind of are communicating again. So this reminded me very much of 2006.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's a really good point about the way it's used in the same way. What is football? I mean, it's not just the game. It's the whole framing. It's the chat. It's the understanding. It's the emotions. So it's not just the 90 minutes. One of the things of the footballization is the way that football chat, talk about football, has become very dominant. You could say talk about sport maybe, but in other countries. There's a very good book that's just come out in English by a historian of football called Injury Time. It argues that the soap opera, which for so long was a dominant thing on British TV, EastEnders, 20 million audience, now 1 million, has been replaced by football as the soap opera. The national soap opera is football, and it's not just who's injured, who's about to be sacked, who's in crisis, who's bought somebody else. There's a whole kind of talk about it which becomes dominant, and it kind of cannibalizes the rest of the media. And I think that's quite in contemporary society. Yes, you can certainly analyse other events. I'm not sure they create the same emotional impact. I think there's something about football, or in particular that the arc of it, the 90 minutes, the emotions, that is particularly powerful. This is the most watched event by miles in history, the World Cup final, by miles. And look at countries want to get in on the act. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, everybody wants in on it, right? Because they know the soft power is from that. I'd be really interested to look more at the German 2006, and of course then redemption narrative of, and now I'm going to get my World Cups. What's the 1950 when they beat Hungary? 54. That's got a very strong redemption narrative, post-war redemption narrative in there as well. Of we're no longer the defeated or something like that. And there's been some brilliant work in football history. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks for this talk, John. I wanted to follow up your tease about the counter-programming, the other 5%. My grandmother. Well, that's right. And there's apparently, for one of the Super Bowls, the Green Bay Packers were in 2011, the local Green Bay station that didn't have the game just broadcast dead air. They didn't want to get in the way. They didn't want to tempt anybody. But usually counter-programming for sports events is highly gendered, and I'm just wondering, where that might fit into the story you're telling about national identity. Is this something that the women who are not football fans are going along with? They're happy to see their boyfriends and their sons happy, or is there something else? Does it factor in at all to this story?
So about gender, I mean, all the images of the parties and stuff, it seems that it's not all men. It's not an entirely male party or celebration. I don't know about that. I mean, that's a whole thing of research that hasn't been done. Often intellectuals actually are very snobbish about football and say, they don't really understand 82. A lot of intellectuals in Italy are football fans, but they're completely baffled by this sort of party and write very snobbish articles saying, so their kind might be in the 5% who are not watching as well, and that wouldn't be particularly gendered. But that's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I mean, obviously, always go to the TV schedules of that day, and I've got my answer. I don't think it will be dead air, but I really am quite curious to find out what it is. And actually, it's only on. So it's on Rai 1, it's only Rai 2 e Rai 3. There isn't even Rai 3, just Rai 2. So there's only 2 channels right at that time.
82 we already start having some of the local channels.
Yeah, and you've got private TV as well.
Yeah, some of the local.
I think private TV, what private TV would have done, would have a load of people in the studio talking about the game, which is often what they do when they don't have the game. Maybe, yeah, some of them, yeah, but yeah. Sorry, I don't really have an answer there, but those are really good points.
Thank you for that. I wanted to ask you mentioned several times how with the 2006 World Cup win, it was not the same and it can never be the same. Obviously, so much has changed since 1982 and with the media, the commercialization of football. But what do you see or what do you imagine or maybe predict the future of Italian football might look like? The World Cup is coming here next summer. Hopefully Italy will qualify.
Italy is not.
Yeah. Well, firstly, 2006. There are some similarities. One of the big ones is scandal and victory, kind of victory wiping out the scandal. So there's a really interesting trope there. So people have argued that one of the reasons they won in 82 was that they were totally inside the group. They thought everybody hated them. They kind of did, and that helped the cohesion of the team. And 2006 the same. They were besieged because of the scandal Calciopoli. There was talk of the captain being sacked, sent home, and that kind of probably brought the group together. And it was a kind of team effort. So there are some things, but what I was really arguing about in terms of the outcome was that the framing was so much more dissipated. There's more than one channel. There's so many other ways to consume sport now. The internet, your phone, social media. You can consume and get so many different narratives. Whereas there, you're really you're really stuck with one narrative. One editor, one framing, one director, one image. You've got no choice. And I think that's really what I was talking about. It felt very much that the legacy of 2006 quite quickly fell apart, whereas 82, I think it really lasted longer, although that's up for debate. In terms of the future of Italian football, I don't think it's not in a good place. There's been a long decline from this golden age of the 80s and 90s. A long decline which doesn't look like it's stopping. And that's an economic decline, it's a social decline, it's a football decline. Italy missed the boat. Italian football was very badly run, very badly managed, missed the boat on the boom, and has now been overtaken by 5 or 6 countries. Whether they can get that back, I think is unlikely. And the kind of symbol of it is the fact that Italy's meant to be hosting an international tournament for the first time in years, 40 years in 2030, because the last time was 1990. And half the stadiums have been judged unsuitable for international football. So there's been no investment in the structure. The structure has been left to crumble, literally, and run by a series of people who are in it for themselves. And they thought the boom was going to go on forever. So I'm quite pessimistic, to be honest. All of the excellence that Italy had in football is still there, but it's been overtaken, and it's an interesting thing because Italy hasn't qualified for how many World Cups in a row? 2, right?